Joining us now on ET Now is Mr. Anand Ramanathan, partner at Deloitte India. He looks at the food processing industry very closely. Mr. Ramanathan, thanks for joining in and speaking with us at ET Now. Let me first begin by asking you, currently the ratio of the food retail sales to GDP from agriculture in India is relatively slow. What kind of opportunities do you see for India in the food processing industry, and what kind of growth can we look at in the near term?
So the levels of food processing in India are much lower than most countries in the world. And even when we look at the Asian countries, food processing in India is about 10% of all the produce that gets grown. So to that extent, there's a big opportunity to look at more processing in the food processing sector itself. And a large part of this is going to be driven by growth in demand from retail, as well as the need for greater convenience. There's a lot of ready-to-cook, ready-to-eat demand now because of the entire COVID-19 situation. And there's the need for looking at safe and secure ways of consuming food. And therefore, there's a big opportunity in food processing. And these levels of about 10% need to go up much higher. When we look at the developed world, many of them would be at about 40 to 50%. And again, if we look at the size of the food industry to the size of the agriculture industry in India, it's roughly a multiple of about 1.5 times the agriculture industry. Now, in a developed context, it's about 4 to 5 times, right? So that's the potential for the food processing sector, which will be driven by ensuring that we have greater levels of processing through varieties which lend themselves to processing rather than growing table varieties, which make it very difficult to process.
Absolutely, Anand. Having said that, if you look at the agriculture and the allied sectors, they contribute pretty significantly to the GDP. Just want to understand from you, do you believe the onset of the pandemic has once again put the thrust on rural development, and how has it really played out for the food processing industry?
Sure. So COVID-19 has played a big role in highlighting demand from rural, as well as it's put back the focus on agriculture. Given that large parts of urban India were locked down, it was still rural consumption which was driving a lot of output. And hence, to that extent, the focus which has come in both from government policy as well as the sheer size of the consumption market in rural and tier 2 is where COVID-19 has really made a difference for the food processing sector. Now, we were to look at specific opportunities. There are about 3 or 4 opportunities that are playing out. One is given the kind of reforms that were announced by the government to look at ways and means to drive productivity in agribusiness. If you look at historically, we've been fairly low when it comes to productivity, the fragmentation of our land holdings, the heavy dependence on monsoons. All of this has impacted the way agribusiness has evolved in the country. So to that extent, if the farmer is able to find the right price in the market, there will be a positive impact on productivity in agribusiness itself, right? So that's one big area where COVID-19 helped accelerate some of the long pending reforms that were anyways due to grow agriculture. The second big impact is around the kind of products that people need. There is obviously a lot of focus on safety and hygiene. Plus, there's focus on convenience. There's focus on looking at products which are easy to consume without too much effort and labor, right? Because everyone is working from home and they are stretched for time. And hence, these have opened up new opportunities, particularly in areas such as condiments, in ready-to-eat, ready-to-cook. If we were to look at, again, safe processed food, especially categories like biscuits, snacks, a lot of them have seen growth during the COVID times because people have been at home and they've needed to consume at home, unlike in the past when they would go outside and consume food services from a restaurant or a cafe. Right, so that's the second big opportunity, which is the need for processed products. And lastly, I think one big area which has opened up because of COVID-19 is also the focus away from cereals. Cereals have historically been what the Indian agriculture sector ever since the Green Revolution has focused on. But there is more and more demand for proteins, which could be animal or plant proteins, and also looking at fresh produce, right, which is horticulture. And a lot of this got driven through e-commerce and direct to consumer kind of models. And hence, there has also been an increase in demand in horticulture products and the way it is made available to consumers through the organized channels. So I think that's the third big opportunity where we are seeing agribusiness gain from COVID-19.
Absolutely. Having said that, if you see in the last few days, Anand, we have seen a whole host of policy announcements also being made in the agriculture space. Case in point, the agriculture reforms, the modification of the APMC Act, the strengthening of the farm gate, etc. as well. How do you see this aiding in terms of the long-term growth potential in the agriculture sector? In fact, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman could also be making certain announcements to aid the rural economy a little more in just a few minutes from now. So how are you looking at the kind of potential that the agricultural reforms will bring in these, in the long-term growth potential of the country?
Oh, there's a lot which needs to be done. This is a start. In terms of implementation, I think one of the biggest challenges has been to translate policy changes at the central government into action at a local level. And therefore, to that extent, the linkages with the state government and also the farmer producer organizations. I mean, that is the key to looking at agriculture and looking at agribusiness revival, because a lot of this is going to be driven by the FPOs and how they are able to implement many of the policies that have been announced. So that's one big area where we will need to see capacity building at the FPO level itself, and also bringing in technology to see that the FPOs modernize and they're able to collectively bargain for better price linkages. The second big area is on the clusters. If you look at food processing, not just in India, but even globally, there's a heavy dependence on availability of the right kind of inputs. And therefore, a lot of development happens at a local level where agroclimatic conditions typically favor the produce which is conducive to that particular region. And therefore, again, building infrastructure which is relevant to each of these different districts across the country will again be somewhere where the state government needs to cooperate very closely with the central government and build in certain value chain areas where each state would specialize in. And therefore, the focus on clusters, I think, is very important for this policy to see success. And lastly, I think technology is going to play a very big, important role, because traditionally it's been a lack of transparency in both prices as well as information, which has impeded the farmer from gaining the right ROI from the investments that he makes in agriculture. And therefore, can we use technology to disintermediate and make both information and prices and knowledge of prices and availability of customers a lot more democratic and available to the farmer to access? So I think technology can play a very big role there. And again, private sector participation can drive a lot of productivity enhancement driven through technology.
Now, the food processing industry is dominated by MSME players. Of course, they have limited ability to invest and also limited access to credit. So how can this be resolved?
Yeah, that's a very important question. About 98% of this sector is still driven through MSMEs. And again, this is private sector participation, right? The MSMEs too are part of the private sector. And therefore, to that extent, what we really need to see is two things. One is we need to find the right crop value chains which are relevant for the country. Now, each state would specialize in certain crop value chains. Can we orient the entire ecosystem from the farmer producing the right processable variety to the MSME, which is going to be not only producing and processing food, but also the ecosystem around it in terms of equipment, in terms of logistics. There's an entire ecosystem which needs to function around that crop. And finally, we need to find markets for the processed output, which needs to either go into the domestic sector or into exports. So what would really help for the MSME sector to take off is for each of these state governments to focus on specific crop value chains and then have a focused effort to provide both funding as well as capability building through research and development for the MSMEs to flourish. So that's one big area where investment is required. The second for MSMEs to do well is, like I said, technology is going to play a very important role because it helps you understand how efficiently the crop is being grown, what kind of output in terms of yield and productivity you can expect from the crop that's being grown. Second, it can help you process a lot more efficiently because you will have technology now through the use of IoT and Industry 4.0, which will help make manufacturing a lot more efficient, a lot more sustainable, optimize the use of power, water, which are the biggest costs for the food processing sector beyond labor and the cost of the processable item itself, which is procured. And the third thing is to also look at how we can use technology to identify customers and markets and get the best prices for the MSME to be profitable. And hence, I think technology will have an important role to play in each one of these different areas. And we will need to look at digitally taking advantage of all the innovation that has happened in different sectors for it to benefit agribusiness also and make MSMEs more profitable.
Sure. Now, currently India is ranked at about number 14 in the list of global exporters. So what do we need to do really to advance in that list?
Sure, I think India has a very strategic location and it has so many agroclimatic conditions that it lends itself to the growth of various kinds of products which are relevant for the rest of the world. And again, if I were to just look at the immediate region, right, whether it's the Middle East, we've had very successful exports of items, say like basmati rice, mangoes, etc., to the Middle East. If we were to look at the entire Indian Ocean rim, starting from the Horn of Africa, moving all the way down to Australia and coming to Southeast Asia, again, I think these are all opportunities where we can even learn from many of these players. If you look at a lot of technology which India has received, it's actually the transfer has happened through from the developed world to some of the Southeast Asian countries to India. Right, and therefore, I believe that a lot of learnings from how agribusiness has been activated in Southeast Asia can also apply to India, especially in areas like, say, marine processing, look at fruit and vegetable processing. These are all areas where we can learn from Southeast Asia and export back to them because all of these markets have big demands. I mean, their population is growing, limited land infrastructure, and hence India can look at not just the export of table varieties, but more value-added products in terms of processable varieties. And I think Middle East is another huge opportunity where we can really leverage all the historical networks that we've built, right? For example, when you've sold basmati rice or say table varieties of mangoes, they've gone into the organized trade in the Middle East, right? So the current ecosystem exists, the infrastructure for exports exists, and hence, how can we leverage and activate and scale it up more to take more products to the Middle East, I think is one big win. And beyond that, I also think that India can play a big role in looking at the entire natural ingredients, right, is a big opportunity in most of these markets. And India does have a tradition of Ayurveda. It has been associated with yoga. And hence, how can we build on this to again take a portfolio of products which are relevant to each of these different countries and build our export markets, right? So these could be two big opportunities which can help increase our exports, which currently are at about 20 billion USD, and there's significant potential to grow the export.